I'd like to begin by thanking you very, very much for the time that you've given us today. And as one of the world's experts, recognized experts on the history of World War II, I'd like you to characterize the efforts of Pope Pius XII in dealing with the issues that he had to confront during the war.
The Pope was in a very difficult situation. One forgets that after the 1st of September 1939, Nazism was dominant in Europe. With each conquest, Scandinavian countries, Norway, Denmark, France, Belgium, Holland, German power increased, and the power of the Gestapo to wreak vengeance on any opponent or anybody who was thought to be acting against the Nazi ideology was enormous. The Pope had responsibility for the whole Catholic community of Europe, and from September 1939, 30 million Polish Catholics were under the heel of tyranny, so anything that emerged from the Vatican might endanger their lives, and he had to walk this extraordinary tightrope between his own feelings, conscience, moral stand, and the lives of Catholics throughout Europe. I think that the Pope and the Vatican had to be tremendously careful at every stage of the war not to make things worse for the Catholics of Europe, who were already suffering tremendously. It's a mistake to think that somehow the Vatican, by its very existence, protected the Catholics of Europe. The Nazis were actively and viciously hostile to any manifestation of Catholic values, and made great efforts to destroy, for example, in Poland, the leadership of the Catholic Church right down to the level of the village priest.
Are you aware of the plan ordered by Adolf Hitler to invade the Vatican State, to kill the Roman Curia, and to seize Vatican property? And can you comment on the accuracy of this threat?
It certainly seems reasonable. One has to search for more documentation, and as one discovers in all historical work, new documentation is emerging all the time, so it would not surprise me if something turned up to confirm this thesis.
Mm-hmm. As an early example of papal outcry, we've been told that the Church spoke out through a pastoral letter from the Archbishop of Utrecht in Holland to protest the arrest of the Dutch Jews. This was answered by an acceleration of arrests and an inclusion of those Jews who converted to the Catholic faith. Are you aware of these events and other examples of Vatican protests against the Nazi regime?
There are many examples of protests, particularly by Catholic leaders, by cardinals, by papal nuncios. And one of the things which I think runs through all these episodes, of which are well documented, is that the Germans responded in the harshest possible way. And one of the things which many papal nuncios tried to do on instructions from the Vatican again and again was at least to protect those Jews who had converted to Catholicism. And even this proved to be an uphill and dangerous task. In my book, The Righteous, I must have 100 examples of Catholic churchmen, senior Catholic churchmen, cardinals, papal representatives, active in every country and taking a lead and taking risks and speaking out publicly. And then the extraordinary case of the Pope himself playing a major part, the leading part, in saving more Jews in Rome, percentage-wise, than was saved in any other capital city except Budapest, which was also a papal initiative. Certainly they tried to intercede in Slovakia, and they tried to intercede in Croatia. The papal nuncio in Croatia, in Zagreb, was particularly active, and of course the Croat regime was a fascist regime, so he was really battling against considerable local opposition, but he did so, and he did so effectively.
Would you comment on the effectiveness of these remarks and the effect that they had on future papal policy?
I think there's no doubt that the Nazi reaction to any protest, including papal protest and protest by Catholic leaders was to accelerate the persecutions. There was no element of give and take. There was simply the element of persecution, and protest was always dangerous. That's why the concept which Yad Vashem, the Holocaust institution in Jerusalem, created many years ago now of the righteous Gentile, is essentially to honor those who took these tremendous risks. It's not to honor people who would of course have been equally honorable, who demanded something and that was achieved. It's to honor people who, at the risk of their lives and the risk of the lives of those for whom they were fighting, did try to speak out.
But I'd like to read just a few of the Jewish comments on the Pope. This was prepared by Golda Meir, who was at that time the Israeli representative to the United Nations and the future Prime Minister of Israel. This is upon his death. He says, "We share the grief of the world over the death of His Holiness Pope Pius XII. During the 10 years of Nazi terror, when our people passed through the horrors of martyrdom, the Pope raised his voice to condemn the persecutors and to commiserate with their victims." Then Nachum Goldman was the president of the World Jewish Congress, had said, "With special gratitude we remember all he has done for the persecuted Jews during the darkest period in their entire history." And then Rabbi Elio Tuaf, who was the chief rabbi of Rome, said, "More than anyone else, we have had the opportunity to appreciate the great kindness, filled with compassion and magnanimity of the Pope, that the Pope displayed during those terrible years of persecution and terror." And then finally, Albert Einstein had said, "Only the Catholic Church protested against the Hitlerian onslaught on liberty. Up till then, I had not been interested in the Church, but today I feel a great admiration for the Church, which alone has had the courage to struggle for spiritual truth and moral truth. I am forced thus to confess that what I once despised, I now praise reversibly. And at any rate, these are the important statements of the Jewish community.
I think that the expressions of thanks were very genuine, and that when someone like Golda Meir spoke, she meant it, because she knew that there had been these many initiatives of efforts to try to help Jews, including the Pope's Christmas message, which had so offended the Nazi hierarchy, who felt the Pope had allied himself with the Jewish world conspiracy, as they defined it.
We discovered that up until the early 1960s, Jewish newspapers, prominent Jewish religious and world figures alike praised the actions of the Pope and his efforts to save Jewish lives. In fact, the Roman Jews erected a marble monument thanking him for the life-saving work that he did. Then there was a complete reversal in Jewish sentiment. What happened to cause this reversal?
But there were then a number of books which were published. Actually, just when I was beginning my historical research and my historical career in the very early 1960s, which really sought to portray the Vatican in the most negative possible light, and culminating and centering around the play by Ralph Hochhuth, which was a tremendous success, and it was a play, it was a polemic. And of course that's why I try never to read fiction, try never to participate in fiction, but it was a powerful, dramatic presentation, an accusation, an indictment, without, of course, any attempt either to defend or to present the documentary evidence that existed. And one has to remember, and I used this in my own work as long ago as 1963-64, that the Vatican had published a substantial series of documents on the war years, which contained important information, which in a sense, if you study it carefully, does go against the thesis which Hochhuth presented. But a play is very powerful. It became a controversial play, and And unfortunately, controversy tends to help the person who is making the accusations. That's what controversy really is about. I didn't find the Hawkwood play historical in any way. It was
Just
more
a fictional play.
It was a powerful attempt to indict the Pope without really going into the issues which we now know a lot about, and some of which were known then, but much more is known now, particularly the role of so many of the cardinals and papal representatives throughout the German-dominated Europe, again and again, to try to mitigate the persecution and to halt the deportations. The most powerful examples being the French cardinals desperately trying to stop the deportations from France in the summer of 1942, through his representative in Budapest, trying and succeeding in halting the deportations of Hungarian Jews to the death camps in the summer of 1944. It was a very legitimate concern. Of course, what Pius XII couldn't know was that in many Catholic countries, Catholics were already being executed for trying to help Jews. The extent of the execution of Polish Catholics didn't become known until after the war, and until a great deal of research had to be done after the war. The other thing which I think is much neglected is his personal role when the Germans occupied Rome, and not the Vatican, but they occupied Rome with its 8,000 Jews. And he took this incredible initiative, having been alerted in the early hours of the morning, took this incredible initiative whereby only 1,000 Jews remained the next day when the SS came to round them up. Some 7,000 had been given sanctuary, not only in Catholic institutions throughout the city of Rome, but in the Vatican itself, several hundred in the Vatican itself.
Which of your books deal with the papal actions during the war?
My book, The Righteous, which is about the Christian unsung heroes of the Holocaust, deals country by country with the reaction of the Catholic churches and of individual Catholics and of the Pope and the Vatican, and shows, I think, quite conclusively the tremendously brave role played by the Catholic Church in every country under German occupation, both to protect its own people, which was clearly a paramount necessity, to protect Catholics from persecution, and also to do what it could to try to mitigate the ferocity of the German racial policy against the Jews.
How would you rate the historical accuracy of John Cornwell's book, Hitler's Pope?
I was very influenced by Rabbi Dallin's rebuttal of John Cornwell. I read Cornwell carefully and found it, again, rather like the Hawkwood play, a powerful indictment, an attempt to indict, and not a balanced account. And the very title sets the reader on a certain course. And also I was quite offended by the photograph on the cover, certainly in the edition which I have, showing the Pope when he was papal nuncio in Germany, apparently going into some Nazi setting, and in fact it's before the Nazis.
We've recently discovered through our independent investigation that through the personal testimony of a 96-year-old priest who worked under the direct papal instruction as the secretary to the Apostolic Nuncio to the Dominican Republic, that he was responsible for secretly shuttling Jewish refugees from Portugal and Spain to the Dominican Republic from 1939 to 1945. They would shuttle no fewer than 2 boatloads of 800 refugees per boatload per year. Were you aware of this activity? And can you give us any other examples of Vatican intervention to save Jewish lives that we may be able to verify?
Well, the Vatican archives are crucial here, and I believe that they show quite clearly that he was in constant communication with all his cardinals, and that their actions, they had no ability really to act independently. I mean, they also informed him of what was happening and sought guidance, and my impression is, and this, as I say, is something the Vatican archives have to really reveal in detail, that it was a constant two-way process. And we see these protests taking place all the time, and we see essentially the leadership of the Catholic Church being active collectively. Well, I'm an archival historian, so I'm a great, I understand what archives contain and what they don't contain. And there's no doubt that this material is there, and the sooner it's made available, the better. I think if there are 30 million documents, everything will be there. I've never yet come across any regime, benign or malign, which didn't keep every scrap of paper. I've published in my book, The Righteous, quite a detailed account of that, and of course Sister Margarita has written a substantial account of it as well. My feeling is that all this material should be assembled, particularly, for example, the evidence you give of this man who intervened in the Dominican Republic, and it should be presented as quickly as possible to Yad Vashem, to the Department of the Righteous, which, when they get such evidence, open a file and make a very serious, independent, historical judicial inquiry. And certainly the evidence which exists now, I'd have thought, would be a very strong prima facie case for something being done. But it has to be done, particularly as you have this witness who's still alive in his 90s. It has to be done tomorrow rather than next week.
I'd like to read to you the placard next to the portrait of Pope Pius XII at the Holocaust Memorial in Yad Vashem. Pius XII's reaction to the murder of Jews during the Holocaust is a matter of controversy. In 1933, when he's Secretary of the Vatican State, he was active in obtaining a concordat with the German regime to preserve the Church's rights in Germany, even if this meant recognizing the Nazi racist regime. When he was elected Pope in 1939, he shelved a letter against racism and anti-Semitism that his predecessor had prepared. Even when reports about the murder of Jews reached the Vatican, the Pope did not protest either verbally or in writing. In December 1942, he abstained from joining the Allied declaration condemning the extermination of Jews. When the Jews were deported from Rome to Auschwitz, the Pope did not intervene. The Pope maintained his neutral position throughout the war, with the exception of appealing to the rulers of Hungary and Slovakia towards its end. His silence and absence of guidelines obliged churchmen throughout Europe to decide on their own how to react. Do you feel this statement is accurate? If not, how would you correct it?
I think it needs correction in many aspects. And there's two I would like specifically to draw attention to. One is the reference to the Pope's active involvement in trying to help the Jews of Hungary in what the statement says was towards the end of the war. Actually, it was at the exact moment of the greatest danger to the Jews of Hungary, who until that moment had not been in danger. The Pope intervened at the very moment of the deportation of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz, and intervened effectively, so effectively that the Hungarian regent, Admiral Horthy, told the SS general in charge of the deportations that they would have to stop, and they did stop. So that's an example in the plaque of really minimizing and, in a sense, belittling something which was of tremendous importance in the rescue of those Jews, who subsequently were protected by direct orders of the Pope, by his senior representative in Budapest, Angelo Rota, who organized the international community to save some 120,000 Jews by giving them the diplomatic protection of the Vatican and other diplomatic representatives in Budapest. The second point I'd raise, which I find quite dangerous in a way in terms of misrepresentation, is about the Pope's non-participation in the Allied declaration of the 17th of December 1942. This was the declaration which came to pass as a result of knowledge of the Holocaust reaching the West in detail, an Allied declaration protesting against the bestial crimes and pointing out that they were a deliberate attempt to exterminate the Jewish people. The Pope didn't and couldn't sign this declaration because he was not an ally. He was not at war with Germany. And had he in any way associated with the Allies, he would, of course, have put the Vatican, the whole papal establishment at immediate risk. He would have become an allied and therefore an enemy, and Germany and Italy were dominant. They were in charge of his little piece of territory. But what is left out in this plaque is that a week later, exactly a week later, in his Christmas message, the Pope made a declaration so extraordinary that I would like to quote the reaction of the senior Nazi hierarchy. This is a telegram.
What year was that, by the way?
December 1942. Mm-hmm. The declaration, the Allied declaration, which he did not and could not participate in, was on the 17th of December, and the Pope's Christmas message was 7 days later. And this is what the Reich Security Main Office, that is the department in which Eichmann was a leading figure in Berlin, informed all its representatives in countries where there were Catholic populations. I quote, "In a manner never known before, the Pope has repudiated the National Socialist New European Order. Here, in this declaration, he is virtually accusing the German people of injustice towards the Jews and makes himself the mouthpiece of the Jewish war criminals." I think the time has certainly come, in the light of what we now know, for the Pope to be put forward for nomination at Yad Vashem in the Department of the Righteous. It's a tough procedure, it's a judicial procedure, but it is a highly respected procedure, and the documentation is examined, and is examined by people who understand what the risks were, what the dangers were, and who are, of course, experts at reading the historical record.
Do you believe the Pope did what he could under the circumstances of the time, or do you believe that he could have done much more?
I think it's very important to try to put the record straight with regard to Pius XII. I do have a general historiographic point to make, if I can, as a professional historian, and that is that in the last 30 years, after, as it were, Golda Meir's very strong recognition of Pius XII's achievements, since then there has been a general tendency among Jewish historians, and a tendency which I understand, to try to find enemies other than Hitler and the Nazis, to try to create a situation where the Jewish people were alone, where nobody helped them, where their enemies were all around, not just in Berlin, but in London and Washington. For some reason Moscow is left out, but in Moscow, and that the Allies, as they're called, were the principal obstacle to the saving of Jewish life, and indeed were, as I've seen in a number of books, somehow complicit in the Holocaust. And of course the Pope fits very easily and attractively into that pattern. Curiously, Yitzhak Rabin, who was a very great Israeli leader, was one of those who saw that there was something wrong in this attempt to say, we are a people who have never had any friends and who at our greatest hour of need were surrounded by enemies, including in the Allied camp and including by the Pope. I think this is changing because more and more is being discovered about just how much the Allies did do, how much they did try to do, even with regard to the bombing of Auschwitz, and certainly with regard to the refugees. It's been said that, for example, no Jews were allowed to escape from Europe to Palestine. In fact, Winston Churchill established a system which I describe in my new book, Churchill and the Jews, whereby any Jew who managed to escape from Nazi Europe could proceed immediately to Palestine on a collective passport, irrespective of any pre-war quotas. So the Pope has certainly been caught up, if you like, in this historiographic time frame, time capsule of blaming everybody except, ironically, the Nazis and the SS. It's a phenomenon which I think is passing, but certainly it should pass. Nations and people constantly rewrite history to fit in with their current situation, their current fears and their current perspectives. But there is such a thing as true history, and I was much influenced myself by a former fellow of my own Oxford College, Merton College, Oxford, Bishop Mandell Crichton, who wrote the great multi-volume history of the popes. And I remember going to see his grave as a young fellow of Merton, starting on my historical career, and there, to my surprise, engraved on his tombstone were the words, "He tried to write true history." I believe there is such a thing as true history, and I think that in this question of Pius XII, the time has come that it should be written.